The neighborhood had always prided itself on appearing uniform, orderly and perfectly maintained, a showcase of suburban ideals under the strict watch of the HOA. Rows of homes, nearly identical in structure, boasted beige siding, manicured lawns, and carefully pruned hedges. To the casual eye, it might have seemed like a quiet, peaceful place. But beneath the surface, tension brewed, as it often does in places where conformity is demanded rather than chosen. Among the homeowners was a man who valued innovation just as much as aesthetics. His home, while still within the community's carefully crafted guidelines, carried subtle hints of individuality. Flower beds designed with rare perennials, a backyard garden arranged in neat raised plots, and a small shed that looked more like a craftsman's workshop than a storage unit. He wasn't rebellious by nature, but he was practical, observant, and forward-thinking. As energy costs rose month after month, he began to see the waste in depending solely on the grid. The state had been pushing for cleaner, renewable energy, and he had read countless articles about homeowners slashing their bills, even earning credits by installing solar panels. The sun above their cookie-cutter homes shone with the same intensity every day. Yet not a single rooftop in the entire neighborhood harnessed its power. It seemed absurd to let such potential go to waste. So, with careful research and meticulous planning, he began preparing. Contractors were called, estimates were drawn up, and permits were secured through the proper city channels. On paper, everything was legal, by the book, and ready to go. But there was one looming obstacle: the HOA. The association's handbook, thick with restrictions and rules, was vague when it came to renewable energy. The section on exterior modifications included a line buried in legal jargon: no installations that detract from the uniform appearance of the community. While it did not outright forbid solar panels, it left just enough wiggle room for interpretation. That wiggle room became the battleground. When the first shipments of panels arrived, carefully stacked on pallets in the driveway, the neighborhood buzzed. Some were curious, some excited, but others, the type who viewed the HOA rulebook as scripture, were visibly unsettled. The whispers began. Panels would ruin the look of the street. Panels would lower property values. Panels would be an eyesore. And above all, panels were not in harmony with the community's vision. By the time the installation crew began climbing ladders and setting the first black panels onto the roof, the HOA president herself appeared, clipboard in hand, surveying the scene with narrowed eyes. Word spread quickly that a formal complaint had been filed before the second row of panels had even been secured. Still, the work continued. The homeowner had his permits and city codes were satisfied. By the time the crew left, the once uniform roof stood out like a gleaming badge of modernity. Sleek black solar panels lined the surface, angled to catch the afternoon sun. The sight of them made some neighbors uneasy, others intrigued, and the homeowner, for the first time in months, felt a spark of independence. His roof no longer just sheltered him, it worked for him. But the HOA did not see it that way. Letters began arriving within days. At first, they were polite notices, citing concerns about the panels. Soon they escalated into official warnings. Phrases like violation of community standards and failure to comply with uniformity requirements filled the pages. Fines were threatened, legal action implied. The homeowner, however, had prepared for this. He knew the state had passed legislation protecting homeowners' rights to renewable energy, and he knew the HOA's handbook, vague as it was, would not hold up against actual law. He stayed calm, paying no fine, responding only with copies of the legislation, pointing out his rights as a property owner. The HOA grew louder, angrier, more desperate. It was no longer just about one man's roof. It was about control. Meanwhile, the panels began to do their job. The electric bills dropped sharply. The system was efficient, soaking up the sun and converting it into clean energy that powered not only his lights and appliances, but stored excess in battery reserves. For the first time, his meter spun backward. What was once a monthly drain on his wallet had turned into a surplus. He wasn't just independent, he was producing more than he used. And then came the blackout. One stormy evening, the grid went down across the neighborhood. Flickering lamps went dark, Air conditioners sputtered, and the silence of powerless homes filled the streets. But not his house. As his neighbors sat in the dark, his solar-powered batteries kicked in seamlessly. Warm light filled his living room. His refrigerator hummed quietly. His home office glowed. From outside, the difference was glaring. One house illuminated and alive, while the rest of the street sat shrouded in darkness. Curtains shifted as neighbors peeked out, whispers spread, and frustration grew. The very thing the HOA had tried to suppress now shone like a beacon of defiance. It wasn't long before neighbors started to ask questions. How had he kept the power on? Was it really just the panels? Could he help them do the same? Curiosity spread faster than the HOA could stamp it out. What had been labeled as an eyesore was now looking like salvation. But the HOA was relentless. Another letter arrived, this time not just threatening fines but demanding removal. They claimed the panels violated the spirit of the community rules, even if they could not cite a specific law broken. They hinted at court proceedings, confident they could pressure him into compliance. Yet by now the homeowner wasn't alone. Several neighbors had already approached him, asking about solar energy. One even offered to buy power from him if it meant keeping their freezer running during the next outage. What began as a personal project was evolving into something bigger. The homeowner saw the shift and understood what it meant. The HOA could push, threaten, and demand, but they were losing ground. The blackout had changed everything. What once seemed like defiance now looked like foresight. And if the HOA kept pressing, the community itself might turn against them. By the time the storm clouds cleared, the stage had been set. The HOA had drawn its battle lines, the homeowner had proven the panel's worth, and the neighbors, once passive, were beginning to take sides. The fight over one rooftop was about to become a fight over the future of the entire block. And as the next round of HOA letters landed in his mailbox, thicker and angrier than before, the homeowner began to consider a move that would not just protect his panels, but transform his role in the neighborhood altogether. The morning after the blackout, the neighborhood had changed. The storm had been brief, yet its impact lingered in the quiet frustration of residents whose freezers thawed, whose homes grew stifling without air conditioning, and whose evenings had been spent by candlelight. Only one house had stood out, glowing against the dark, a reminder of what was possible. That image clung to everyone's memory, and with it, whispers spread from driveway to driveway. While the HOA tried to reassert control with another round of letters, the tide of opinion began shifting in unexpected ways. Neighbors who had once muttered about aesthetics now muttered about survival. The homeowner at the center of it all sensed the change and knew it was time to act. He couldn't rely on good fortune alone. If the HOA pushed into legal territory, he would need more than panels. He would need leverage. That leverage came in the form of state law, obscure but ironclad. Weeks earlier, while preparing for this very conflict, he had spent late nights digging through legislation. Buried within the statutes was a provision known informally as the Solar Access Law. It barred HOAs from prohibiting renewable energy installations, as long as the installations met safety and efficiency standards. More importantly, it granted homeowners the right to use and distribute excess energy if properly registered through the local utility. It was that last phrase, use and distribute, that sparked an idea. He had been producing more energy than he consumed. Until now, it simply flowed back into the grid, earning him credits. But if he registered as a micro-producer under state guidelines, he could go further. He could legally sell energy, not just to the utility, but to his neighbors. The idea was bold, maybe even reckless, but it was the kind of move that could tip the balance. If he became not just a solar homeowner, but the neighborhood's power supplier, the HOA's complaints would collide head-on with his growing influence. So he filed the paperwork. It wasn't simple. There were forms, inspections, approvals, but he had time, patience, and determination. Within weeks, his system was reclassified. What had started as a personal project was now a registered microgrid. On paper, he was no longer just a resident with panels, he was a power provider. The HOA, of course, didn't know this yet. Their energy was focused on escalating their campaign of pressure. Letters turned into threats, threats into meetings, and meetings into official resolutions condemning his installation. But the more they pushed, the more cracks appeared in their authority. Some neighbors quietly voiced support for the panels, citing the blackout. Others, while not openly siding with him, stopped parroting the HOA's complaints. Neutrality itself was a shift. Then came the second test. Another outage, this time longer, swept across the grid. For nearly 48 hours, the neighborhood sat in suffocating heat. Refrigerators spoiled, phones died, and tempers flared. And once again, his house stood resilient. Lights burned, fans turned, and his battery reserve stretched effortlessly through the days. This time, though, he did not simply bask in his own independence. He acted. He offered to run extension cords to immediate neighbors, just enough to power fridges, charge phones, and keep essential devices alive. For many, it was a lifeline. Families grateful for cold food and working fans passed word quickly. Soon, a small but undeniable truth spread. When the grid failed, the HOA president's rules meant nothing. What mattered was the homeowner's panels. The HOA fumed. They called his act unauthorized utility operation and accused him of exploiting a crisis for attention. But the neighbors saw it differently. For them, he had provided what the HOA never could: real help, real security. And as the storm of complaints rolled on, he unveiled his next move. By now his microgrid registration had been approved. Legally he could sell power to others. And with the growing interest, he set up a system. Neighbors could connect during outages, or even subscribe to purchase steady backup power at a fraction of the utility's rate. It wasn't about profit, though the money was welcome. It was about building a network of support the HOA couldn't touch. What began with a single rooftop now rippled outward. Extension cords became proper connections, battery packs were charged and shared, and the homeowner slowly evolved into the block's unofficial energy provider. Families who once frowned at the sight of his panels now defended him in HOA meetings. One even stood up and argued that the panels raised, not lowered, property values, because who wouldn't want to live near guaranteed backup power? The HOA's fury reached its peak. The president, red-faced and relentless, called emergency sessions, drafted cease and desist letters, and even hinted at litigation. They claimed his solar business was a violation of zoning. They claimed his cords and connections were safety hazards. They claimed, above all, that he was destroying the uniform look of the community. But every claim they made collided with reality. The cords were temporary, the zoning allowed renewable energy distribution, and the state's solar access law shielded him at every turn. And as each legal attempt faltered, the HOA looked weaker. The president, once feared, began to appear desperate, out of touch, and increasingly irrelevant. Meanwhile, the homeowner grew stronger. His lawn became a meeting place for neighbors eager to learn about solar. He gave tours of his system, explained the benefits, and showed them copies of the legislation. Some began planning their own installations. A quiet revolution was taking root, powered by the very panels the HOA had tried to ban. By midsummer, the shift was undeniable. 3 more homes had panels on order, and several others had joined his subscription system. His house, once isolated in defiance, was now the nucleus of a growing network. The HOA could no longer frame him as a rogue outlier. He was becoming the example. And yet he knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA was regrouping. They had begun consulting attorneys looking for loopholes of their own. Rumors spread of new amendments to the bylaws, stricter enforcement of vague aesthetic standards, and even the possibility of suing him personally for damages to community value. But he wasn't intimidated. He had the law, the neighbors, and the power literally on his side. The HOA could draft as many letters as they wanted, but at the end of the day, when the lights went out, it was his house that glowed. The stage was set for a final confrontation. The HOA president, cornered and furious, was preparing for a showdown, and the homeowner, now more than just a resident, but a leader, was ready. The question was no longer whether he could keep his panels. The question was whether the HOA could survive the wave of change he had unleashed. And as autumn approached, with another round of storms on the horizon, the answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The quiet suburb that once prided itself on its manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and strict adherence to the HOA handbook had now become something it had never expected, a small, thriving hub of renewable energy. What had started as one homeowner's desperate attempt to outmaneuver arbitrary restrictions had ballooned into an unexpected community-wide transformation. The house at the center of it all, once scrutinized for daring to step outside the lines, now stood as both a lightning rod for conflict and a beacon of possibility. The HOA had not given up easily. By the time the second cease and desist letter landed on the homeowner's doorstep, the solar infrastructure was already far more than panels on a roof. Battery packs quietly stored excess energy in the garage, and the grid-tied inverter hummed softly, ensuring the system pushed power back into the network whenever production exceeded consumption. What the HOA saw as a violation, the homeowner knew was a legitimate arrangement, approved by the local utility and sanctioned under state-level protections. This was no rogue operation. This was strategy, executed with precision. But the deeper issue wasn't legality, it was pride. The HOA board felt challenged, humiliated even, that a resident had managed to expose the fragility of their authority. Their carefully curated power over appearances, over sameness, over conformity, now had a visible crack running through it. And that crack, like sunlight pouring through drawn blinds, only grew wider as more neighbors began to realize the opportunity staring them in the face. First, it was the Johnsons next door, weary of rising energy costs and the rolling blackouts that had plagued the city during last summer's heat wave. Then the young family at the end of the street, tired of choosing between running their air conditioning and keeping the grocery bill balanced. Slowly, almost timidly, one household at a time began asking questions, running the numbers, and whispering about how they might also join in this rebellion, disguised as practicality. The HOA responded with a frenzy of newsletters and stern warnings. They claimed solar panels would destroy property values, would look unsightly, would create glare hazardous to drivers. They even tried to imply that panels might pose a fire risk, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. But each attempt rang hollow compared to the undeniable truth visible in real time. The house they sought to punish was no eyesore. In fact, it looked pristine, orderly, modern, and most importantly, it functioned. The lights stayed on when others flickered. The yard was lush because the homeowner could afford to run sprinklers without fearing the bill. The driveway was alive with the hum of electric cars charging overnight. The tipping point arrived one evening when a storm swept across the area, knocking out power for nearly the entire neighborhood. For hours, houses sat dark and silent. Refrigerators warmed, Wi-Fi dropped, and panic spread in whispers. But one house glowed softly through the rain, porch lights shining steady, warmth radiating through curtained windows. And then, as word spread, extension cords began snaking across wet lawns, neighbors lining up sheepishly, grateful and humbled. Phones were charged, medical equipment was powered, and warm food was shared. That night, the balance shifted forever. The house once accused of violating the rules had kept the neighborhood alive. The HOA board held emergency meetings, their voices sharp, their tempers high. They considered lawsuits, fines, even removal of the homeowner altogether. Yet the more they fought, the weaker they looked. Each threat they issued only highlighted the contrast between their rigidity and the resilience of renewable energy. Worse, some of their own members began quietly asking for help installing panels. The illusion of unity fractured. Within months, the homeowner wasn't just running their own system. They were operating what amounted to a private microgrid. By pooling resources, several neighbors installed shared batteries, turning their collective homes into a patchwork of energy independence. Money that once lined the pockets of distant utilities now circled within the neighborhood. Monthly bills shrank, families saved, and slowly, resentment toward the HOA's resistance grew louder. The HOA tried to reframe the narrative, attempting to claim credit for supporting green initiatives. But it was too late. Everyone remembered the letters, the warnings, the threats. Everyone knew the truth. This transformation hadn't been led by the board. It had been sparked in defiance of it. In time, local media picked up the story. A news van parked at the curb one sunny afternoon, cameras capturing shots of children playing basketball under the glow of solar-powered streetlights neighbors had pooled together to install. The segment aired that evening, painting the neighborhood not as a battleground but as a model for community-driven sustainability. Other neighborhoods called, asking how they could replicate the system. City officials took notice, praising the ingenuity. What had been an act of rebellion became a blueprint for the future. And yet, beneath the victory, there was still a current of tension. The HOA president, once smug and certain, now found herself increasingly isolated. Meetings were sparsely attended, her authority eroded. Some whispered about recalling the board entirely, replacing them with a committee more attuned to reality. Change, it seemed, was inevitable. The homeowner, once a quiet participant in the community, now stood at its center. But they hadn't sought the role of leader, only the right to live without arbitrary obstruction. Ironically, in resisting control, they had become a unifying force. On weekends, block parties sprung up powered entirely by solar-fed generators, bounce houses inflated, music played, and no one worried about the electric bill. Porch lights glowed late into the evening as neighbors lingered, laughing and sharing food. The sense of connection, once stifled by rigid enforcement of uniformity, blossomed into something genuine. The HOA's handbook still technically forbade solar panels, but it no longer mattered. Rules without respect are like walls without foundations. They crumble. The homeowner had not just built a system of panels and batteries, they had built something harder to dismantle: momentum. By the time the next annual HOA meeting rolled around, the writing was on the wall. A vote was called, and the board was swept out in a landslide. The bylaws were amended. Solar panels, once prohibited, were now celebrated. What had started as punishment became policy. And the homeowner, once threatened with fines, now stood as the example everyone pointed to when they spoke about what was possible. The story ended not with bitter rivalry, but with a neighborhood transformed. The lawns were still neat, the houses still matched, but above them glistened rows of panels angled toward the sun. The air was fresher, the bills were lighter, and the nights were brighter. The HOA's attempt to control the future had instead ushered it in, and so from one denied request came a quiet revolution. From a single house, an entire block found resilience, and from defiance came renewal. Because sometimes the brightest light shines only after someone tries to turn it off.